Oh, I didn't see you there. You caught me doing history work. Let's learn about the Middle Ages, why don't we?
In 476, we've learned the Roman Empire collapsed in the West. This was the result of a long resource crisis. The territory could not support a large population anymore. Why was this? The weather and overfarming. Winters grew longer and years of farming sucked important nutrients out of the soil. Well, the weather was too cold. Winters were longer. There wasn't enough time to plant multiple crops in a year. And the soil was overworked, planting the same crops in the same field year after year. It sucked the nutrients out of it. And the Romans didn't have artificial fertilizers that they needed to make that soil fertile again. So what happened? Well, as a result, Western Europe really changed. What had been a complex urban society with lots of specialized workers, with cities, with thriving trade, with advanced technologies like concrete that was used to build massive buildings and aqueducts supplying water to these cities, supporting a population that could read and write, that largely disappeared. The population declined, cities disappeared, and Rome itself shrank to only 35 to 40,000 residents by the 600s. That's what we mean when we say the Roman Empire collapsed in the West. Forests covered 80% of Europe by the year 700, and most people lived in small, isolated farming villages, separated by dangerous forests full of wild beasts, scary monsters. That's what they thought. Trade declined. Travel was difficult. Most people ate, wore, used things that were produced in their own locality. Farmers didn't produce very much of a surplus to trade.
Do you have anything to trade? Just carrots! Ha! Same as me. Looks like we're both well stocked. True enough. Just carrots! Just carrots.
So, while Byzantium and this new growing Islamic empire were thriving and continued to support a complex urban society, Western Europe was poor, underpopulated, and divided into many, many small kingdoms and principalities, which often were at war with each other. By the early 700s, Europe was broken up into many smallish kingdoms. Then, in the late 700s, Charles the Great, known as Charlemagne, conquered most of France, Germany, and Italy to create what he considered to be a reborn Roman Empire. Crowned on Christmas Day in 800 as emperor, he created what is now known as the Holy Roman Empire. But after his death in 814, this empire quickly fell apart, the victim of civil war among his grandsons and invasion from a new threat, the Vikings.
I conquered this whole kingdom, and between my grandsons fighting and the Vikings invading, it's all gone. Sad, really. Oh, I didn't see you there. I was doing some history work. Let's learn about Vikings, shall we? I can read!
Though Europe was poor and had no strong military to protect it, it was an age of intense faith. Almost all of Europe was Christian, practicing a faith headed by the Bishop of Rome, who we call the Pope. This form of Christianity is called Roman Catholicism. Most people in Europe at the time could not read, but medieval monks kept learning alive, retreating to isolated monasteries where they could meditate and pray and copy books. On mountaintops or isolated islands, they took vows of poverty and sometimes silence, and spent their days removed from the world. Ironically, many of these monasteries became rich because wealthy people at their deaths donated land and gold so that the monks would pray for their souls. Being isolated, unprotected, and full of potential loot, monasteries were the perfect target for a new threat from the north, the Vikings. The Vikings, or Norsemen, came from Scandinavia, from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. They were originally farmers, but as Europe entered into a cold period, many of them became raiders. Starting in the 700s and accelerating into the 800s, more and more Vikings started to get in their ships and attack to the south. Their ships were technologically advanced, and they could travel over open seas and also up shallow rivers. Monasteries were their first targets, but the Vikings also began to attack towns and cities near the coasts or far inland on rivers.
Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. I was just dreaming about history things.
These invasions were a clear sign of European weakness. There weren't enough people, soldiers, wealth, or organized government to keep these Vikings out. But by the end of the 900s, there were clear signs that things were improving. Europe began to revive, to become more prosperous. And the key to that revival was a change in the way that agriculture was practiced. One of the most important changes was a new kind of plow. The Romans plowed, of course, but they used a scratch plow. It only scratched the surface of the soil, which was good in the dry Mediterranean climate. You didn't want to release a lot of moisture from the soil. But you had to plow each field twice in a crosshatch pattern. And it was human-powered. It took a lot of labor, human labor. But in the 900s in Northern Europe, a new invention was created. It was a heavy-wheeled plow called the karuka. It dug deep into the earth, turned over soil, and this worked really well in the heavy, wet soil of Northern Europe. And it was more efficient. You only had to plow each field one time. And better yet, it used less human labor because the plow was pulled by a team of oxen. The new plow meant one farmer could do a lot more work than he could in the past.
Hands are up. The flag drops and the chestnut leaps out of the gate. Look at that burst of speed. The ox is trying to keep up, but the horse is already a length. Now 2, now 3 ahead. Galloping.
Using oxen was more efficient than human-powered plows, but oxen are slow. The Romans, for all their technical expertise, never really figured out how to attach horses to heavy loads. The Roman collar went across the horse's neck, and when the horse pressed on a heavy load, it would cut off their wind and they would collapse. So Romans never attached horses to plows or to heavy carts. But in the Middle Ages, after the year 900, Europeans cracked this problem.
Steady now, lads. Step on. That's it. Keep the line true. Easy over the clods. Good beasts. Hear that soil turn? That's winter bread sleeping under there. A little more to the left. I like that. We'll have this stripped.
The Europeans invented a new harness for horses that went across the chest of the horse so that the horse could push into it and pull a heavy cart or a heavy plow without passing out. And once a horse was attached to a plow, it turns out they were about twice as fast as an ox, which meant that one man could plow twice as many fields in one day. And that's the definition of efficiency. One disadvantage of horses, though, is that their hooves get soft in wet soil. And when you plow, you're in wet soil. But the Europeans solved that problem as well. They invented a new thing, the horseshoe.
No, not that kind of shoe.
Horseshoes today protect horses from walking on hard concrete, but when they were first invented, they were designed to protect the horse hooves, which get soft when it's wet, from the dangers of mud. And they would put nails that stuck down so the horses would have more traction so they could actually get grip while they pulled that heavy plow. So the new collar and the horseshoe combined allowed Europeans to be way more efficient in their plowing.
Now, that's good plowed soil. Ready to be planted with wheat.
The last big technological innovation was a change in crop rotation. Farmers need to let their fields rest. The Romans knew this. they divided their fields in half and farmed 50% each year. They let one side lie fallow, and they grew a crop on the other side.
With 3 field crop rotation, I can farm more of my land every year and use fewer workers to do it. It's genius!
In the Middle Ages in Europe, a new form of crop rotation developed. This was called a 3-field crop rotation. In a 3-field crop rotation system, instead of dividing the field in half, it was divided up into thirds. Farmers would plant a spring crop in 1/3, might be beans, might be peas. They'd plant a later crop, a summer crop, in the second third, usually a grain, wheat, barley, oats. And then the last third, they would let rest. That would be their fallow field. By making this change, now they were farming 2/3 of their land instead of only a half. That's a big increase. It's counterintuitive. You would think that farming 2/3 of the land every year would take more people to do the work, but in fact, that's not the case. You needed fewer people to farm more land. And that's because of the way farming works. There are certain periods of the year in a farm life cycle that require lots and lots of labor. That's during plowing and during harvesting. In a 2-field crop rotation, you need enough people to plow and to harvest half of the land at once. In a 3-field system, you only need enough people to plow and harvest 1/3 of the land at once. So this is an incredible increase in efficiency. You're plowing 1/3 more land and using 1/3 less labor. But you might be asking, isn't the soil going to get overworked? And that's a real concern. But it turns out that if you plant peas and other legumes, that sucks nitrogen out of the air and puts it in the soil. Then if you plant wheat the next year, the wheat sucks the nitrogen out of the soil and uses it to grow. They didn't understand the chemistry of this. They only knew that it worked. I've been emphasizing technology, and it's important. But we also have to recognize that climate change is important. Around the year 1000, Europe entered into a warming period, and that allowed 3-field crop rotation to happen because the growing season extended, started earlier, and went longer. And so you could plant a spring crop, a summer crop, and get that plowed and harvested in the time needed.
Take a few minutes and take some notes, why don't you?
Now let's talk about... Stay down, scholar! Easy. I don't even... Ow! For the North! I guess that's one way to start a discussion.
Well, as I was saying before, I was so rudely interrupted. Let's talk about how Europe became more peaceful after the year 1000.
After the year 1000, Europe was getting more wealthy. Farms were producing more, population increased. Between 1000 and 1150, the population of Western Europe increased by 40%, from 30 million to 42 million people. And as surpluses grew, there was more trade. Towns grew, and specialized workers became more common. Bigger buildings, including beautiful Gothic cathedrals, began to be constructed.
Oh no! Somehow, I've been turned into a cartoon!
At the same time that Europe was getting wealthier, it was also becoming more peaceful. The Viking invasion stopped because Europeans had created more powerful defense systems, including larger armies, castles, and smaller kingdoms merged to become bigger political entities. You can see in the map, Europe is starting to look a lot like it looks today, with the Kingdom of France, England. As a result, there were fewer wars being fought. Fewer countries means fewer opportunities for conflict. One of the reasons that kingdoms got larger is because Europeans started to use a different form of inheritance. At the time of Charlemagne, if you remember Charlemagne from earlier in the video, Europeans practiced what's called equal inheritance or equitable inheritance, where a king would take his territory and divide it equally among all of his sons. In the case of Charlemagne, he had one son, so he passed all of his territory down to him, but then his son had three sons. So there were three grandsons of Charlemagne. And as a result, when the territory was passed on, that large empire that Charlemagne had created was divided up into three, which of course began to fight with each other. After the year 1000, Europeans began to practice what's called primogeniture, in which only the oldest son inherited the land and the title from their father if they were a noble.
You are my fourth son. I'm afraid you are not going to inherit anything.
Father, I understand. I will become a landless knight.
That allowed kingdoms to remain big, to grow, but it also meant that younger sons had a problem. If you were third, fourth, fifth son, you probably didn't inherit much, and you had to find something else to do besides being a king or a noble.
When I grow up, I want to be a knight.
So what could younger sons do? Well, some of them joined the church and became priests and tried to work their way up and to become a bishop or a cardinal, and maybe even pope. That was an honorable profession, but a lot of people didn't want to do that. You could become a merchant, but that was sort of looked down upon. There were universities starting to appear. Oxford and Cambridge were founded by the year 1200. So there was a possibility that you could go and study to be a lawyer or a doctor, but again, that wasn't super prestigious. What young boys who were the children of nobles really wanted to do was to become fighting men. The honorable profession was to become a knight.
Today, I am a warrior.
Today, I am a warrior.
But here's the situation. If you're a knight, you need income. You need money coming in. And the way most knights got income was by owning land. They might own a village or two, and those villages produced crops that were sold that the knight could then use the proceeds to buy his warhorse, to buy his armor, to pay men to help him out. But what would happen if you were a knight and you didn't own any land? You were a landless knight. So Europe was getting more peaceful. There were fewer wars. The Viking invasions were over. There was less of a need for knights. But young noblemen still wanted to be knights. That adds up to a surplus. There were too many fighting men. Europe had too many fighting men and not enough wars for them to fight in. And that caused problems. As you can imagine, having a surplus of young knights hanging around in society with swords and horses, wandering around with little to do, that can be problematic to a society.
Make me a sandwich, peasant! Go on, then.
You've got hands, don't you? Use them.
And there are clear signs that these potentially violent young men needed to be controlled. The first sign is that the Catholic Church created what was called the Peace of God, that told knights they were not allowed to fight on Sundays or other religious holidays.
Please, no fighting on Sundays! Did you hear that? Oh, mercy! It's the Lord's Day, my sons. Show a little peace.
This was often ignored, and we know it was ignored because there kept being constant reminders to remember the peace of God. A system of tournaments featuring mock battles and jousting was created across Europe, and this was designed to have some fun, but also to give unemployed knights a chance to practice their craft of fighting without endangering peasants or townspeople. Knights who performed well in these mock battles or jousting hoped to get hired to fight in armies of rich nobles or kings, and the hope was that they would be rewarded with a gift of land so they could settle down and stop being landless knights. This was also the period that new stories about mythical kings like King Arthur and ideal knights like Lancelot began to circulate. And these stories taught knights a new code of behavior called chivalry. These stories of chivalry taught the knights should fight only for their king, for their church, and for their chosen lady. Knights were expected to treat women well and to help, not to abuse the poor. Chivalry was clearly an attempt to keep young knights from behaving badly. I'm not sure how well it worked. And finally, we get to the main topic of this video, the Crusades. One of the reasons the Crusades was possible is because there was a surplus of fighting men. There were too many soldiers in Europe looking for something to do. Europeans were trying to control them with codes of behavior, by giving them tournaments to participate in, by preaching Christian ideas about when fighting was okay. But you can also see the Crusades as an enticing opportunity to send a lot of dangerous fighting men thousands of miles away from Europe to attack somebody else.
Take a few minutes and take some notes, why don't you? Oh, I didn't see you there. I was just practicing sword fighting. Let's learn about the Crusades, shall we?
We must go to liberate the Holy Land!
In the year 900, Europe was being attacked by the Vikings. They couldn't keep them out. 200 years later, Europe was able to send over 50,000 soldiers all the way to the Holy Land to conquer Jerusalem in a crusade. The Crusades are a clear sign that Europe had become richer, more powerful, more populous, and more prosperous. The year's 1095. The Pope, a guy named Urban II. He's in the south of France. He's talking to a crowd that have gathered to hear what he has to say. He says, and I'm quoting, "From the confines of Jerusalem and from Constantinople, a grievous report has gone forth that an accursed race has violently invaded the lands of these Christians and has depopulated them by pillage and fire." What is he talking about? The accursed race, that was the Seljuk Turks, who had recently stormed Baghdad, taken Jerusalem, and conquered all of Asia Minor from the Byzantine Greeks. The Byzantine emperor, who at that time was Alexius Comnenus, appealed for assistance against the Turks. He needed help against these invaders. In response, the Pope called on the knights of Christendom to join a crusade, a military expedition, to rescue Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the Muslim Turks. Urban II's speech was probably one of the most influential in history, caused a lot of change. And he concluded by saying, "Jerusalem is a land fruitful above all others, a paradise of delights. That royal city, situated at the center of the earth, implores you to come to her aid. Undertake this journey eagerly for the remission of your sins and be assured the reward of imperishable glory in the kingdom of heaven." And when he finished, the crowd went crazy.
But wait, there's more. If you go on this crusade, your sins will be forgiven and you will get a free trip to...
And it just so happens that Jerusalem is very rich. Lots of loot, if you know what I mean.
The knights who responded so positively to Pope Urban's call for a crusade were an interesting crew. Many of them were second, third, fourth sons. What does that suggest about their motives? Were they after loot? Land? Or were they genuinely religious? Were they trying to protect their church? Did they want to get into heaven? That's something we need to talk about. And thus began the First Crusade. Over the next 2 centuries, there were about 8 official crusades and countless unofficial ones, but it's the first one that we're going to focus on, and it was probably the most successful. The First Crusade was called in 1095, really got going in the year 1096. I talked earlier about this idea of a surplus of knights, that Europe was more peaceful and didn't need so many fighting men. The Crusades can be seen as a way of dealing with that surplus. Sending 50,000 knights 1,000 miles away certainly left the civilians of Europe safer from attack from their own fighting men. And the First Crusade saw some success. The armies began to gather in Europe in 1096 in 3 different places, and then they proceeded to walk the long distance from Europe to Constantinople. And by 1097, 3 huge armies of knights had gathered outside the walls of Constantinople, which was sort of unexpected from the people in Constantinople. They had called for help. They didn't know this much help was going to arrive. And 50,000 European soldiers outside the gates of Constantinople made them nervous. So the Byzantine emperor said, "Go that way. Keep going east." The Frenchmen, the Germans, the Englishmen, the Scots, the Italians, the Spaniards, led by counts and bishops, not by kings, kept going east. And finally they marched into Muslim territory and got to the city of Antioch, which is in modern Syria. And strangely, they found there was no defense. There weren't any Muslim armies there. Why? Well, because the local Muslim armies, which were Turkish, were way south in Egypt, fighting a little civil war, which was quite lucky for the Crusaders, who managed to walk into Antioch and take it without hardly having to fight at all. The Christian Crusaders who walked into Antioch assumed that God was on their side, that this was a miracle. A Muslim historian, Ibn al-Athar, reports from the time a different story. He tells us that the Muslims were not in Antioch to defend it because they were down south fighting with Egyptian Muslims. But the Christians didn't know that, so they went inside Antioch and hung out until the Muslims figured out what had gone on and rallied their army and came back to Antioch and surrounded the city. And now the Christians were trapped inside. So much for good luck.
But
So we conquered the city of Antioch. But now we find ourselves trapped inside. We are surrounded by...
Horse is all we have to eat.
Not as bad as rat.
The situation looked dire. They were surrounded, trapped in Antioch. They didn't have enough to eat. They were eating their horses, running out of water. But Ibn al-Athar tells us that the Muslims didn't like their leader, a man named Carbuga, who was vain, liked to take the credit for himself. And so the people that were fighting for him didn't really want to fight for him. And once again, the Christians lucked out. Al-Athar tells an interesting story. He tells us that a crafty monk with the Christians took a lance, a long spear, and buried it in a place that he knew about in Antioch. And then he told the Christians, Crusaders, that he'd had a vision that if they could find the lance of Jesus, that they would win the battle. So they looked around. Where is this lance? And finally the monk took them to where it had been buried. They dug it up, and hooray, they had the lance of Jesus. Ibn al-Athar was a Muslim. He didn't believe any of this stuff. He thought that the Christians were just being foolish. But this tells you that these Christian crusaders really were true believers. They really did believe it. And when the situation got so desperate that they couldn't stay inside anymore because they were going to starve to death, they walked out expecting to be slaughtered by the Muslims. But instead, the Muslims turned around and galloped off. From the Christian perspective, it looked like that lance of Jesus had worked. It was a miracle. They'd won.
What do you have there?
This is the lance of Jesus! With it, we will certainly triumph!
But why did Jesus have a lance?
That's not important. What's important is that now we are going to win!
Ah, yes! To victory!
But Ibn al-Athar tells us it wasn't a miracle. Instead, the Muslim soldiers had gotten so fed up with their leadership that instead of staying to fight the Christians, they turned and ran away. And what were the Christians left with? They were left with the leftover food, the leftover horses that the Muslims had left behind. And that allowed them to continue onward in their trek towards Jerusalem. And they finally got there in 1099. They walked a long way. Took them years finally to get to Jerusalem, but they got there. In the summer of 1099, about 12,000 Crusaders got to the walls of Jerusalem. Only a quarter of the original Crusaders were still left. Many of them had died. Many of them had given up and gone home. But the ones that were left besieged the city for a month. They prayed and they marched around barefoot around the city. And finally, on July 15th, they managed to capture the city, to get over the walls. And what happened? A dreadful slaughter. Muslim men and women were chased through the streets and murdered. The Jews of the city were rounded up, herded into the temple, and burned to death. In eyewitness reports, piles of heads, hands, and feet were to be seen in the streets of the city. But these were small matters compared to what happened at the Temple of Solomon, where men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. So they won. They took over Jerusalem, but it was pretty bloody. And what did they win? Well, they gained control of Jerusalem, though they didn't keep it for that many years. The longer-lasting thing that they won were what was called the Crusader kingdoms. They conquered a stretch of land in what's now mostly Israel, along the coast of the Mediterranean. They had a stronghold at a place called Acre. That was a very, very strong castle, and that was the center of the European stronghold in the Holy Land. But they gradually lost territory until the last of the Crusader towns, which was Acre, was finally conquered in 1291. So they didn't hold very much land, and they didn't hold it for very long. But they did achieve their objective. And many of the Crusaders ended up with land, with titles. They were no longer landless knights. They were knights with land, even though that land was thousands of miles away from their original homes. Lastly, I want you all to think about the motivations of the Crusaders. Why did they go? Why did Pope Urban call for the Crusades? Were they driven by religious motivation? Or were they driven by a desire for wealth, for land, for fame, for power, or some combination of all three? That's for you guys to figure out. You're going to have some documents, including Pope Urban's speech, some of the text from Ibn al-Athar, and I want you to use that to come up with an argument about why these crusaders went on this crusade.
Oh, I didn't see you there. I was working on your next writing assignment. Let's talk about it, shall we?
Obviously, these videos are generated by AI. As Abraham Lincoln said, don't trust everything you see on the internet.
The videos are silly and not always accurate, but you should be better prepared to write your last essay of the year about what motivated the Crusaders to go on a long and dangerous campaign.
I also want you to ask questions about motivation in general. Why, for example, did I make this video?
You will need to read and use Pope Urban's speech to support your ideas about the motivations of the Crusaders. Remember these clips?
There's more. If you go on this crusade, your sins will be forgiven and you will get a free trip to...
And it just so happens that Jerusalem is very rich. Lots of loot, if you know what I mean.
You will also have to use the Muslim source. What was their perspective about the motivations of the Crusaders?
And I also want you to think about motivation more broadly. Are people driven by a desire for wealth and power, or by ideas like religion? We'll pick another example to compare to the Crusaders. We will talk about that next class.
Thanks for watching this. Take the rest of the period to get started on your writing. The assignment has been posted. See you next week. Thank you.
Crop this season, eh? Never seen so many.
Hi, carrots as big as a... carrots! Why not a rutabaga?
That's not the line.
I lost it completely.
You did.
All right, here we go. Stay back, Savage.
By Odin's beard, this library shall be, oh, no. Ha! I blew it. Good. Sorry, that was me. I couldn't keep it straight.
You having fun yet?
I'm always having fun.